Hello everyone and welcome back to the second video dedicated to this ongoing series called The Noir Connection, a series of videos in which we explore the influence and the impact of film noir in more contemporary movies. If 2 weeks ago we covered The Fabulous Baker Boys, a relatively overlooked and underseen and unknown even movie that you wouldn't necessarily link to the film noir genre or style, in today's video we will talk about a movie that I think many of you, especially if you've watched it, immediately comes to mind in terms of being film noir reminiscent. I'm talking about L.A. Confidential, released in 1997 and directed by Curtis Hanson.
The Night Owl Massacre. This is a heinous crime that requires swift resolution. 6 victims. One of them, one of our own. Interrogations will be led by Lieutenant Edmund Exley.
I need some backup. Come on.
All right, college boy, I'll help.
There's something wrong with the Night Owl. I just can't prove it.
The first thing I think we need to mention when we talk about L.A. Confidential is precisely Los Angeles. For L.A. Confidential, it's even in its title, it's a story inextricably linked to a city. The movie, as some of you would know, or many of you would know, was based on a novel written by James Ellroy. And while I haven't personally read the book, which is something that I really want to correct this year, I do believe it's fair to say that it is a worthy adaptation of his work. The character and nature of Los Angeles permeates and conditions the narrative, in my opinion. In classic film noir, as we discussed in quite a few videos last Noirvember, we discussed how the city, urban spaces often played a very important part. They would practically always represent oppression and the seed for sin, corruption, alienation, chaos, fear, greed, injustice, and also very importantly, loneliness. Out of all the cities depicted and featured in classic film noir, which could be a whole topic of videos on its own, Los Angeles always had a kind of a special allure. It's been also mentioned by L.A. Confidential's director and cinematographer that the city also has a special light that makes it also the perfect scenario for cinema. That is why in movies in general, Los Angeles has never been just a mere background. It was always, or almost always, a character on its own. The juxtaposition of a whole glamorous facade versus a sordid undercurrent is precisely what we find in L.A. Confidential, and it's definitely something that James Ellroy is an expert on. Even for me, a person who has never set foot in LA, nevertheless, I am quite familiar with several spots just because of how many times I've seen it in films. Obviously, for those of you who have been to Los Angeles or who live there or have lived there, you will find some locations in this movie noted for their nostalgic feel. Places like the Frolic Room, the Formosa Cafe, or Crossroads of the World are shown in this movie. It is a city that perfectly represents the contradictions within society, the contradictions within the characters of this movie, and I for one can certainly understand the appeal of shooting and making films in Los Angeles. A very important person in terms of achieving the feat of shooting in period Los Angeles and doing so as effectively as it's done in L.A. Confidential is a person or a role in making movies that I seldom talk about, but that is very important, which is the art director and production designer. Again, when researching about L.A. Confidential, I found out that there was a very renowned woman called Janine Opperwall who is and was highly regarded for working in movies that were period pieces. Movies like The Bridges of Madison County, Catch Me If You Can, or Pleasantville were some of the movies that Janine helped come to life. Her experience as a set and production designer in the early 80s made her the perfect asset in terms of creating the illusion of a period of 1950s. This movie is actually set in 1953. Over time, Janine Opperwall has worked with directors like James L. Brooks, Clint Eastwood, Steven Spielberg, or Brian De Palma. Quite an astounding career and resume for this woman and this particular job that, again, I seldom mention and I should more often, because again, the knowledge and craftsmanship and artistry of these people is really mind-blowing, especially I'd say in period pieces. Their work as it is, I'd say, with costume design and makeup, I think it's very important. In this case, I must say that Curtis Hanson, although he put a lot of effort again in depicting the period, in showing 1950s in LA. From what I've heard from him in interviews, he also didn't wanted the whole aesthetic to become something that would come in the way of showing the journey of the characters. So while he was very preoccupied on showing the era, he also specifically told Italian cinematographer Dante Spinotti that he didn't want a film noir look. Spinotti's work can also be notably seen in films like Heat, The Last of the Mohicans, and The Insider. In my opinion, it has a lot of the elements, again, of classic film noir, but the form is entirely 90s. Curtis Hanson is a director that sadly passed away a few years ago, but he was a very eclectic filmmaker, I should say, with movies like The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, Wonder Boys, or 8 Mile with Eminem, so quite an eclectic career. But he's a director who got a lot of praise specifically for L.A.Confidential and then Wonder Boys. He went on to win an Oscar for the adaptation of the novel, along with screenwriter Brian Helgeland. Brian is a screenwriter and also director who is highly regarded, especially for his adaptations in movies like, again, L.A.Confidential or Mystic River in his case. He's an expert, I should say, in crime fiction, and from what I've also been able to learn, he was an absolute fan of James Ellroy's books, to the point where he went to a book signing and met James Ellroy and became fascinated with the idea of adapting one of his novels and got to do so with L.A.Confidential. In terms of adapting the actual book, from what I've been able to read and hear from other people, it seems like it was a massive task because of how intense and how dense L.A.Confidential is. It has a convoluted plot. It is full of threads, full of characters, backstories that obviously didn't make it to the film. According to Curtis Hanson and Brian Helgeland themselves, they just concentrated the story to what happens with 3 specific characters, and the rest they just kind of discarded. So what you actually see in the movie, without going over the plot, because it's already pretty convoluted as it is. So essentially, again, what you see in the film adaptation of L.A.Confidential is the story of 3 police officers, 3 LA police officers with very different personalities and very different approaches, who along the way end up working together as they face police corruption, the rise of tabloids, in an environment when you also find Hollywood celebrities, racial injustice, social injustice, all the works really. What's interesting about L.A.Confidential is that the characters are deliberately introduced in a way that make you later question your previous thoughts on them. And so, as I said, you get to see their evolution, much like the city in which everything takes place. Nothing is truly what it seems to be. And it is precisely, for me, the way they are introduced, one of its most engaging parts. There are different scenes along the way that are pretty gripping, and I'd say that towards the end of the movie, it's when it becomes more like a 90s action film, if you will. But what's always there, I should say, is that focus on the characters and a compelling story that speaks a lot about our different stances in society as well. And it sadly, again, depicts conflicts that are still very very relevant. In regards to the noir connections to the film noir elements that we can find in L.A. Confidential, again, they mostly have to do with their source material, with the crime fiction novel upon which it's based. So we find archetypical characters that are reminiscent of the genre. We have police officers, detectives, femme fatales. We also have, as I said, a convoluted plot. We have voiceovers. We have tiny flashbacks. However, the music by Jerry Goldsmith and, as I mentioned, the cinematography are not deliberately stylized to appear like classic film noir, which I think, in my opinion, is a great choice, and one of the reasons why, upon seeing this movie quite recently, still holds up, I should say, even though it has been roughly 24-25 years since it was released. However, 1997 was a very packed year in terms of film releases that we still talk about and remember very vividly, such as Titanic, Good Will Hunting, The Full Monty, As Good as It Gets, Gattaca. Well, maybe Gattaca no one talks about, but I love Gattaca. I mean, 1997, coming to think of it, was an incredible year in terms of movies. But again, coming back to the references to classic film noir, another thing that is very apparent when it comes to talking about L.A. Confidential, it's also its references to classic Hollywood stars, especially classic Hollywood actresses like Veronica Lake or Lana Turner. I was also very glad to see that This Gun for Hire with Alan Ladd and Veronica Lake makes a brief appearance in L.A. Confidential. As I've also read, to prepare for this movie, Curtis Hanson, who was already an admirer of directors like Alfred Hitchcock and particularly Nicholas Ray, did watch some classic movies like In a Lonely Place, The Bad and the Beautiful, also films like The Lineup or Private Hell 36 or Kiss Me Deadly. I think that it's quite nice that they had all these movies in mind when they were shooting L.A. Confidential. Curtis Hanson also had pictures of Aldo Rai for the part of Bud White, which is the part that Russell Crowe plays. And if you think about it, the feel, the attitude, I don't know, I can see that a lot. And also for Guy Pearce, he had a picture of Guy Madison, an actor that today is pretty much forgotten, but Guy Pearce is completely on another level in this movie, I should say. Curtis Hanson wanted relatively unknown actors for this movie. I think he really wanted audiences to go through that journey that I was mentioning at the beginning, in which you're really not sure where these actors are coming from and why they behave the way they behave. And I think that was a brilliant choice, in my opinion. This movie was a great breakthrough for both Russell Crowe and Guy Pearce, I should say. They had both worked in Australia. Russell Crowe, I think, is from New Zealand and Guy Pearce is originally from England, but they had both worked extensively in Australia. They were, again, relatively unknown in the US, but that changed thanks to L.A. Confidential. The three main characters that I was alluding to in the beginning were played by Russell Crowe again, Guy Pearce, and Kevin Spacey. But then we have a supporting cast with people like Danny DeVito, James Cromwell, or Kim Basinger, one of the few female characters in the movie, but a really important character in my opinion. And out of all of them, aside from Russell Crowe, Guy Pearce, and Kim Basinger, who's also magnificent in this movie, and she went on to win an Oscar for her performance here as a supporting actress. But if there's one actor that I think it's often overlooked and who I think is fantastic in L.A. Confidential is James Cromwell, who is linked also to classic film noir because he is the son of John Cromwell, who was a director and actor himself, who got to make a few film noirs like Dead Reckoning with Humphrey Bogart and Elizabeth Scott and The Racket with Robert Mitchum. Sadly, his career ended abruptly due to the Hollywood's Red Scare and blacklisting in the 50s. So I think it was brilliant casting having James Cromwell, the son of John Cromwell, in L.A. Confidential. If you're not familiar with James Cromwell, he plays Captain Dudley Smith in L.A. Confidential, but he's mostly known for the movie Babe, and he is in real life a huge animal rights activist, but his part in L.A. Confidential couldn't be far from that, and I should say it's an acting tour de force, and everyone enhances each other's performances. In my opinion, it is one of the best casts, I'd say, in more contemporary movies. For me, precisely, the journey that the characters go through is what makes the movie most interesting to watch. I think these three characters represent us all very well, but in the end, what happens is that they all have to work with one another, and none of them is strictly one way or the other, which again ultimately speaks about all these contradictions that we still see constantly in the world, in society, in media, but which we cannot escape. Alright, so that was all for today's video. This was, again, a quite heavy movie to talk about. There's a lot to cover, but I hope it was interesting and not super dense and heavy. But as always, I would love to know your opinions on L.A. Confidential if you have watched it, and also if you have also read the novel by James Ellroy. If you want to continue learning about L.A. Confidential, there are a few things that I would like to mention. If you want to know more about the people who made it possible, I would highly encourage you a website that probably some of you know about. It's called Cinephilia and Beyond, and they do extensive articles and essays on movies. There's one about L.A. Confidential in which you find lots and lots of information about the people who made it possible, and that it was really super interesting. I also would love to recommend you another video that is a video essay by the channel Essays on Frame by J.P. Lee, and she has a very interesting video about the character analysis of L.A. Confidential. She talks in depth about these three characters that I was talking about in this video, so by all means, it was a very interesting video for me to watch. I will leave all the links down below in any case. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for sharing the love for classic movies. I hope that you stay safe, that you take care, that you have a wonderful week, and see you all very soon with my next video. Bye! A very iconic thriller like The Hand That Cradles the Rock. That cradles the rock. And I think there's something that they achieved, at least from... I have two words. Rollo Tomasi.